All right. Hey there, and welcome to this episode where we're going to talk about the fear of evil or blasphemous or unwanted thoughts. And so for those of you that don't know me, my name is Matt Cotty, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm the founder of Restored Minds. And on this episode, I want to create a kind of high-level view of, the fear of unwanted thoughts, right? Or the fear of evil thoughts or twisted thoughts. I mean, however you want to say it, it's like you're having these, the experience we're talking about is really these thoughts that are coming up into your conscious awareness that you know are not reflective of who you are, and so you fear their very presence, and you fear what they mean about you. And so when we talk about these fears, let's go ahead and dive into what we might classify them as, right, first. And so these fears generally fall into kind of three categories, and they're usually the fears of violent thoughts or harmful thoughts, right? And they could be images, they could be what-if thoughts, right? They're also the fears of, intrusive sexual thoughts or, any kind of thoughts that are sexually inappropriate, and then also the fears of, religious thoughts, and this could be fears of possession, fears of going to hell, as well as existential ideas like what's the meaning of life, and then getting locked on that and trying to figure it out, right? And what we need to understand to begin is really that, so first, these thoughts kind of fall into what we used to call pure OCD, right? And some people still call it that. I personally don't believe in that term, because pure OCD stands for purely obsessional, and it means that it's a, form of OCD that only has thoughts, right? It's only obsessions. It's pure obsessions, no compulsions. And the reality is that's just not true. Anyone that I've ever dealt with that has worked with this, as well as, myself as well, everyone does compulsions that has these thoughts, or everyone does behaviors that reinforce them. Most of the behaviors people do are just things like, mentally ruminating, analyzing, a lot of mental behaviors, as well as things like avoiding, right? Avoiding is a behavior, right? So if you're avoiding things that trigger you, like that's a behavior, right? Like that's keeping that loop going, as well as getting reassurance and checking and all of the above, right? So every case that I've come across with this particular, kind of spectrum of intrusive thoughts and fear of unwanted thoughts, there's always behaviors that are going on. So that's the first thing, is that it's not some like special form of OCD, right? And so if that's something that you're holding on to, I really encourage you to let that go, because it's just misinformation. And if you really kind of go through, and identify the behaviors you're doing, like you'll find behaviors. I've never come across someone who hasn't. And so that's number one. Number two is that we need to understand that these thoughts are normal, right? Like that's one of the most difficult parts about this, right? Is that when you are experiencing these intrusive thoughts, what happens is people internalize the experience, meaning like, okay, well, I'm having this bad thought. What does that mean about me? And then they go into this like hyper responsibility mode of like, I need to protect everyone, or I need to make sure I never do something like that. And, all these behaviors start to form to, quote, protect themselves, right? And, or try to make sure that unwanted thought never comes true, right? And when we think that the content of the thought is the problem, we've already, lost this battle in many ways. And so let me go ahead and say that again. So when we believe that this is a content problem in the mind, right? Like the content of the thought itself is the problem, we're not focusing on the real problem. So that's one of the major points that I want to make in this episode. If you're dealing with these thoughts, and especially on a repetitive basis, these thoughts keep popping up and popping up and popping up, right? You don't have like that. And again, more importantly, you're having this, anxiety and stress response happen. And then, you find yourself doing these behaviors, and this is happening on a loop, right? And this has been ongoing and ongoing and ongoing. One of the things is that, look, these thoughts that you're having are normal, because, most people experience intrusive thoughts. Number one. Number two is that these thoughts, one of the reasons that you're reacting to them in an adverse way is because you know that they don't reflect who you really are. And that's why those are thoughts of what we call ego dystonic, right? The thoughts aren't a reflection of who you really are, and you know that, which is one of the reasons you're reacting to it. And finally, if we believe that the content is the problem, right? If we believe this is really I'm going to go to hell problem, or, whether or not, you're worrying about your sexuality, or worrying whether you're going to turn into a serial killer or hurt someone, if you believe that that is the issue you're dealing with, you see how misleading that is, because as long as you believe that that's the issue, you're always going to do behaviors that are going to then try to make sure that doesn't happen. Once we realize this is an intrusive thought problem, though, and by doing behaviors to try to get rid of them, it's going to keep you stuck in that loop, right? And that's what OCD is, right? Or really any form of anxiety is a big loop you get caught in, right? Because the more and more you do behaviors that reinforce that something's dangerous, your mind keeps producing that thought, and then therefore the stress response kicks off again, right? Or anxiety, and then you engage in the same behaviors, right? And then that loop just forms, right? And so we need to step back and realize that the content of the thought is not the problem we're dealing with. And I know that that is such a hard concept to really understand, but that was my issue, right? Is like, because you're so ashamed usually of these thoughts, people live these super reclusive, very, very small lives, because, they're worried about what people would think if they even told them about these thoughts. And so if you're dealing with these thoughts, it's so important that you obviously find places that you can, like people that are dealing with them too. So you start to realize that you're normal. And, it's a normal experience. And that's one of the first things that I do when I work with people that have these thoughts, is really just normalizing it. And, I can't tell you just story after story after story that I've heard of people that have been dealing with these thoughts for years, decades, and just never told anyone, And so, over at Restored Minds, we have our exclusive private community where people can connect with other people and share. And we have our live calls where, you get to just hear from people that are dealing with the same stuff, right? And that's why it's just, it's so important to congregate and realize that you aren't alone with this, because this is not something that people are going to openly share a lot about. So realizing that you're not alone is just one of the things that I really want to point out in this episode, is that if you're dealing with this, in many ways, this is normal. What's abnormal is this loop that you're getting caught in. And the reason you're getting caught in that loop is because you're doing behaviors, right? You're doing these safety behaviors that are keeping that loop going and really fueling that fire. So one of the ways that we go about treating this, right, again, is what we call through exposure and response prevention. What is response prevention? It's really behavior prevention, right? We're not allowed to do those safety behaviors. And once we learn to habituate to the experience of these thoughts, right, by not doing behaviors, we stop reacting to them like they're dangerous, and that's actually what breaks us out of that loop. And if you think about it, if you look back in your own life, especially if you've dealt with this for any length of time, there's probably a good possibility that you've used to worry about something that you don't worry about anymore, right? And so when someone says what's recovery with this like, right? Or like, how do you recover from this, or how do you get better? Think about something you used to worry about that doesn't bother you anymore, right? And then when that thought pops into your mind, you have no reaction to it, right? You have zero reaction to it, because the thought is not the problem, and you realize that. So when the thought pops up, it's like, okay, no big deal. Most people go back, the backwards approach with this. We're trying to get rid of the thoughts. We don't want the thoughts, right? And that's, because we're afraid of them. But the problem is that when you try to get rid of the thoughts, there's a paradoxical approach, right, of a paradoxical effect, essentially, and the thoughts become worse and worse and worse, and the anxiety becomes worse. So when we talk about how to treat this, really it's about eliminating the behaviors. And when you eliminate the behaviors and actually do the process correctly, and we walk you through that at Restored Minds as well. If you haven't gone through our Taking Back Control program, that's a great place to start. But when you start having those thoughts and you're engaging in behaviors, that's going to keep it going, right? When you eliminate the behaviors, the stress response calms down, and the thought becomes just a thought. And if you really, kind of think about it on a meta level, if you've worried about something in the past, right, and you've gotten over it, quote unquote, right? People say that, well, I used to worry about that, but I got over it. What does that really mean? Well, it means that you stopped engaging behaviors that reinforce that. And what happened is you don't respond to that thought anymore. That's what getting over a fear really means. It's like, I don't respond to it anymore like that. It's not that that thought doesn't pop up in your head. It's just if it does, it doesn't matter. And that's really the goal of, any kind of fear of unwanted thoughts. I mean, that's what we want to get to the point where that thought doesn't matter anymore. And that's the treatment objective. So, hopefully you found this episode helpful from like kind of a high level perspective. What I want to do moving forward is really make a series on, very specific types of unwanted thoughts, as well as, kind of case studies and things like that. So if you are looking for help with this, we have resources down in the notes below that you can get over at Restored Minds. So please go check this out. And always, we really appreciate your support by liking and subscribing and sharing, to really get this to people that need help. And so thank you so much for hanging out today, and I will see you guys soon. Take care.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you found it helpful, chances are someone else will too, and we'd really appreciate your support by liking and subscribing, and also sharing this video on your social platforms. Also, if you're looking for additional help, we have some resources right down in the links below to help you on your journey. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you soon.